My mother was a sin eater. I don't expect you to know what that means. Most people don't, not anymore. It's an old practice, older than this country, brought over from Wales and Scotland and the dark corners of Ireland, where the church's light never quite reached. When someone died with sins too heavy to carry into the afterlife, the family would call for a sin eater. They'd lay bread and salt on the chest of the corpse, pour a cup of ale or wine, and the sin eater would consume it all, eating the sins of the dead so their soul could pass on clean. It was considered unholy work, necessary but unholy. The sin eaters were outcasts, shunned by decent folk, because everyone knew what they carried inside them. Every sin they'd ever eaten, every dark deed they'd ever absorbed was still in there somewhere, rotting, festering, waiting. My mother never talked about how she'd become a sin eater. I asked her once, when I was 8 years old, and she just looked at me with those tired gray eyes and said, "Some things choose us, Eliza. We don't get a say." She died when I was 17 in the winter of 1987, and the things she told me on her deathbed, the confession she made, the burden she passed on, changed everything I thought I knew about our family, our town, and the creek that ran behind our house. The creek they called Solomon, the creek where nothing ever grew on the banks, and the fish all swam with their bellies facing up, and the water itself seemed to whisper when the moon was full. Before I tell you about my mother's death, I need to tell you about another death, the one that started everything. In the autumn of 1961, a man named Harlan DeWitt walked into the Solomon Creek Baptist Church during Sunday service, doused himself in kerosene, and set himself on fire. I know this because my mother was there. She was 14 years old, sitting in the third pew with her parents, singing Amazing Grace, when the back door swung open and Harlan came walking down the aisle with a gas can in each hand. She said nobody moved at first. They just watched him, frozen, as he poured the kerosene over his head and struck the match. He burned for a long time, longer than a person should be able to burn while still standing. My mother said he walked all the way to the altar before he finally collapsed. And the whole time he was burning, he was speaking, not screaming, speaking, calm and clear, like a man reading from Scripture. She said he kept repeating the same words over and over until the fire took his tongue. The creek remembers. The creek is hungry. The creek will have its due. Nobody in Solomon Creek talked about that day. It was erased from the town's memory the way a body is erased by lime, deliberately, thoroughly, completely. The church was rebuilt. Harlan DeWitt's name was never spoken. His widow moved away, and his children were scattered to relatives in other states. But my mother remembered. She remembered everything. And 26 years later, on the night she died, she told me why Harlan DeWitt had really burned himself alive, what he'd been trying to warn people about, and why the creek that shared his town's name was so much more than just a creek. We lived in a small house on Moravian Road, about a quarter mile from where Solomon Creek curved around the base of Kettle Mountain. It was just the two of us. My father had left when I was 3, disappeared one night, and never came back. And my mother refused to speak about him except to say he was gone. I learned later what gone really meant, but that comes later in the story. My mother started getting sick in the fall of 1987. It came on slow at first, a cough that wouldn't quit, a tiredness that sleep couldn't fix. By October, she couldn't get out of bed. By November, she couldn't keep food down. The doctors in town said it was cancer, but I don't think they really knew. I don't think anyone knew what was eating her from the inside, except her. She knew exactly what it was. On the night of December 3rd, 1987, my mother called me to her bedside. The room smelled like sickness and candle wax. She'd insisted on candles instead of electric light, said the buzzing of the bulbs hurt her ears. Her skin was the color of old paper, and her eyes were sunk so deep in her skull that she barely looked human anymore. But her voice was strong, stronger than it had been in weeks. "There are things I need to tell you," she said. "Things I should have told you years ago, but I was too afraid, too ashamed." She gripped my hand with fingers like bird bones. "You're going to hate me when I'm done, but you need to know. You need to understand what's coming." I told her she could tell me anything, that I loved her, that nothing could change that. I was wrong on all counts. My mother's name was Ruth Ann Whitley, and she was born in Solomon Creek in 1947. Her father was a coal miner, her mother a seamstress, and they lived in a company house with 6 other families all crammed together like sardines in a can. It was a hard life, but it was the only life anyone knew. When Ruth was 7 years old, her grandmother came to live with them. Her name was Cora Whitley, and she was the oldest person Ruth had ever seen. Skin like crumpled tissue paper, eyes like 2 drops of milk. She walked with a cane carved from black walnut, and she smelled like lavender and something else, something Ruth could never quite identify. It was the smell of sin, my mother said, the accumulated weight of 100 lifetimes worth of transgression soaked into Cora's bones and skin and blood, because Cora Whitley was a sin-eater. The 7th in an unbroken line stretching back to the old country, to a village in Wales whose name had been deliberately forgotten, and she hadn't come to live with the family because she was old and needed care. She'd come because she was dying, and before she died, she needed to pass on the gift. "It doesn't work like you might think," my mother explained, her voice rasping in the candlelit darkness. "A sin-eater can't just quit, can't just decide to stop. The sins we carry, they're alive in their own way. They need a host, and when the host dies, they need somewhere to go." She coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made my stomach clench. If a sin-eater dies without passing on the gift, the sins get released. All of them, all at once, pouring out into the world like poison from a burst wound. And they don't just float away. They find hosts, living people, innocent people, who suddenly find themselves carrying the weight of every terrible thing the sin-eater ever absorbed. She looked at me with those sunken eyes, and I saw something in them I'd never seen before. Fear. "That's why the line can never break," she said. "That's why there always has to be another. And that's why my grandmother chose my mother. And that's why my mother chose me." Her grip on my hand tightened. "And that's why, God forgive me, I'm choosing you." Now I need you to understand something before we go further. If this story is reaching you, if you're still here listening, then you're already part of it. That's how these old stories work. They don't just entertain, they involve. They wrap around you like roots and pull you down into the dark soil where the truth lives. So if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that notification bell too, because the next part of this story, the part about the creek itself, is something you need to hear all the way through. Some tales you can walk away from halfway through and be fine. This isn't one of them. Trust me on that. Now, where was I? My grandmother's name was Miriam, and she became a sin-eater in the winter of 1923, when she was just 11 years old. She didn't want it. Nobody wants it. But Cora was dying, and the sins were churning inside her like a nest of snakes, and there was no one else. The ritual itself was simple, terrible, but simple. Cora lay in her bed with a plate of bread and salt on her chest, a cup of blackberry wine in her hand. Miriam knelt beside her and, under Cora's whispered instructions, ate the bread and drank the wine, while reciting words in a language she didn't understand. When it was done, Cora Whitley let out a long breath and died, and Miriam felt something move inside her, something heavy and cold and ancient, settling into her belly like a stone dropped into a well. She said she could feel them, the sins, the memories, the guilt of 100 strangers, all swimming around in her gut, looking for a place to nest. She was sick for a week afterward. Fever, chills, nightmares that seemed to last for days. But eventually, she recovered. And when she did, she understood things she hadn't understood before. She could look at a person and see the darkness inside them, the lies they told themselves, the cruelties they'd committed, the shameful secrets they kept locked in the basements of their hearts. It was like having a window into the ugliest parts of the human soul, a window that could never be closed. She hated it, but she accepted it, because what choice did she have? For the next 24 years, Miriam Whitley served as the Sin Eater of Solomon Creek. She was called to dozens of deathbeds, ate the bread and salt of dozens of sinners, absorbed their transgressions so their souls could fly free. She married, had children, lived what looked like a normal life, but inside her, the weight kept growing. In 1947, the year my mother was born, something happened that changed everything. A man named Josiah Carver died in his farmhouse on the outskirts of town. He was 87 years old and had been a pillar of the community, church elder, town councilman, founder of the Solomon Creek Savings and Loan. Everyone respected him. Everyone loved him. But Miriam knew the truth. She'd known it the first time she'd shaken his hand, 10 years earlier, and seen the blackness coiled inside him like a tapeworm. Josiah Carver was a monster. He'd killed his first wife and buried her in the crawl space under his barn. He'd sired children on 3 different women in town and then threatened to destroy them if they ever spoke. He'd burned down a competitor's business and watched from across the street as the family inside screamed for help. He'd done things to children, things my mother couldn't bring herself to describe, even on her deathbed. And for 87 years, he'd gotten away with all of it. When he died, his family called for Miriam. They wanted their patriarch's soul cleansed, his passage to heaven secured. They didn't know what he'd done. Nobody knew, except Miriam. She should have refused. She knew that now. She should have let his sins die with him, let them scatter into the world rather than take them into herself. Because some sins are too heavy for any one person to carry. Some darkness is too deep to absorb. But she was afraid. Afraid of what would happen if she broke the tradition. Afraid of the other sin eaters in her line, who she could sometimes feel watching her from the other side of death. Afraid of failing in her duty. So she ate the bread, drank the wine, and took Josiah Carver's sins into herself. The change was immediate. My grandmother had always been a quiet woman, gentle and soft-spoken. But in the weeks after Josiah Carver's funeral, something shifted inside her. She became irritable, then angry, then violent. She said things she'd never said before, cruel things, cutting things, words that seemed to come from somewhere outside herself. She started having blackouts. She'd come to hours later in strange places with no memory of how she'd gotten there. Once, she woke up standing waist deep in Solomon Creek, her nightgown soaked through, her hands full of mud and river stones. She didn't remember walking there, didn't remember anything except a voice, a man's voice, whispering in her ear, telling her that the creek was hungry, that the creek needed to be fed. On August 15th, 1947, a 4-year-old boy named Thomas Freely wandered away from his family's farm and was found 3 days later at the bottom of Solomon Creek. He drowned, the coroner said. A tragic accident. The creek had been running high after a summer storm, and the boy must have slipped on the muddy bank and fallen in. These things happened. They were terrible, but they happened. But Thomas Freely didn't have any water in his lungs. Nobody noticed this at the time. The coroner was old and overworked, and the family was too grief-stricken to ask questions. The boy was buried in the Solomon Creek Cemetery, and the town moved on. My grandmother knew, though. She knew because she'd done it. Not consciously, not willingly. But the sins of Josiah Carver had grown too strong inside her, and they'd found a way to express themselves. They'd used her body like a puppet, walking her through the night to the Freely farm, luring the boy from his bed with whispered promises, carrying him to the creek, and holding him under until the bubbles stopped. She didn't remember any of it, but she felt it afterward, the satisfaction, the satiation, like a hunger finally fed. And she knew, with a certainty that made her want to tear her own heart out, that the sins would want to be fed again, that they would always want to be fed again. My mother paused here, coughing so hard that I thought she might choke. I gave her water, held her hand, waited for the fit to pass. When she finally spoke again, her voice was even weaker than before. "Your grandmother killed 6 children over the next 14 years, she said. 6 children, all drowned in Solomon Creek, all ruled accidental deaths. And every time, she woke up the next morning with no memory of what she'd done, only that terrible feeling of satisfaction, of fullness, like she'd just eaten a meal after starving for months. My stomach turned. I wanted to pull my hand away, to run from the room, to pretend I'd never heard any of this, but I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped by the weight of her confession. She tried to stop it, my mother continued. She tried everything, locked herself in her room at night, tied herself to the bedpost, had my grandfather nail the window shut, but it didn't matter. The sins always found a way. They always got what they wanted. She turned her head to look at me, and there were tears running down her withered cheeks. So in 1961, she decided to end it. Not by passing on the gift. That would just transfer the sins to someone else, and they'd keep killing. No, she decided to die without passing them on, to let the sins scatter into the world, spread so thin they couldn't do any real damage. She swallowed hard. She was wrong. My grandmother Miriam died on October 3rd, 1961. She hanged herself in the barn behind our house, leaving a note that said only, "I'm sorry. Burn my body. Don't eat the bread." Her husband found her the next morning. He was devastated, confused, and completely unprepared for what happened next. The moment Miriam's heart stopped beating, the sins began to scatter. My mother was 14 years old, sleeping in her bedroom, when she felt it, a wave of cold darkness washing over her, through her, into her. She said it was like being drowned in ice water, like every terrible thing she'd ever heard about or imagined was suddenly living inside her skull. She saw things, felt things, memories that weren't hers, urges that made her want to scream. But she was lucky. She only caught a fragment, a sliver of the whole. The sins had spread throughout the entire town, seeping into every man, woman, and child in Solomon Creek, and the town went mad. In the 6 weeks following Miriam's death, Solomon Creek experienced more violence than it had seen in the previous 100 years combined. A father of 3 drove his car off Kettlebridge with his whole family inside. A teenage girl poisoned her entire household, then walked into the woods and was never seen again. 2 brothers beat each other to death in their front yard, while their mother watched from the porch, unable to move, unable to scream. And then there was Harlan DeWitt. Harlan was a good man. Everyone said so. A farmer, a deacon, a devoted husband and father. But he was also sensitive, my mother said, more sensitive than most. When the sins scattered, he absorbed more than his share. And unlike the others, who acted on their newfound darkness without understanding it, Harlan knew exactly what had happened. He'd been a friend of my grandmother's. He'd known what she was. And when he felt her sins pouring into him, felt the hunger for the creek awakening in his blood, he understood that he had a choice. Could let the darkness take him, do its bidding, feed the creek until his body gave out, or he could destroy himself before the darkness could use him. He chose fire. The creek remembers, my mother said, echoing Harlan's final words. That's what he kept saying. The creek remembers. The creek is hungry. She turned her head toward the window, toward the darkness outside, where Solomon Creek ran cold and black. And he was right. What do you mean? I asked. How can a creek remember anything? My mother closed her eyes. Because it's not just a creek, she said. It's a grave, the oldest grave in these mountains. And what's buried there has been waiting a very, very long time to wake up. The story my mother told me next came from her grandmother Cora, passed down through the line of sin eaters going back generations. It was old when this country was young, old when the first settlers pushed into these mountains, old when the native peoples walked these ridges and gave this land its first names. Long before Solomon Creek was called Solomon Creek, it was called something else. A word in a language nobody speaks anymore. A word that roughly translates to the throat, because that's what the creek was. A throat, a passage, a way down into a place that was never meant to be disturbed. The native peoples knew about it. They knew that something lived at the bottom of the creek, something that had been there since before the mountains rose and would be there long after the mountains crumbled. They didn't worship it. Exactly. It was too terrible for worship, but they fed it. They gave it offerings, and in return, it stayed asleep. When the settlers came, they didn't understand. They saw a creek, nothing more. They built their farms and their mills along its banks. They drank its water and fished its depths, and let their children play in its shallows. And slowly, over decades, they stopped feeding it. That's when the drowning started. The first official drowning in Solomon Creek happened in 1847. A farmer named Ezekiel Solomon was found face down in the water, his hands full of river mud, his lungs full of black water that the doctors said smelled like rot. They named the creek after him, a memorial, they thought, a way of honoring his memory. They didn't understand that the creek had taken his name as a kind of payment, a partial payment, anyway. It wanted more than names. It wanted flesh. It wanted souls. It wanted to be fed the way it had always been fed, back when the native peoples understood what it really was. And when it didn't get what it wanted, it started taking. The drownings continued throughout the 1800s, 1 or 2 a decade at first, then more. By the turn of the century, Solomon Creek had claimed more than 40 lives. Men, women, children, all pulled down into its dark waters and never seen again. That's when the sin eaters came. My mother didn't know exactly how it started. The early history was murky, passed down through oral tradition changed and distorted with each telling, but she knew that at some point one of the sin eaters, maybe Cora's grandmother, maybe someone even further back, had made a deal. The thing in the creek fed on darkness, on sin, on the black weight of human transgression, and the sin eaters were full of exactly that kind of darkness. So they made an arrangement. The sin eaters would continue their work, absorbing the sins of the dying, gathering up the darkness of the community. And every few years, when the weight became too much to carry, they would go down to the creek and release it, feed it, give the thing at the bottom what it craved. In return, the drownings would stop, the creek would stay quiet, the town would be safe. It was a terrible bargain, but it worked. For over 100 years, it worked, until Josiah Carver. His sins were different, my mother said, heavier, hungrier. When your grandmother absorbed them, they didn't just sit inside her, they grew, they took root, and they connected her to the thing in the creek in a way that none of the previous sin eaters had ever been connected. She opened her eyes and looked at me. The creek didn't just feed on what she gave it, it started feeding through her, using her to take what it wanted directly. The children she killed, she thought she was satisfying the sins inside her, but really, she was satisfying the creek. She was becoming its instrument. And when she died without passing on the gift, the connection didn't break. It just scattered, spread to everyone in town who absorbed a piece of her sins. They all became instruments for a little while. That's why everything went mad. That's why Harlan burned himself. He could feel the creek inside him, feel it trying to use him, and he'd rather die than let it. She coughed again, weaker this time. But the scattering didn't last. The sins were too spread out, too diluted to be useful. The creek needed a focus, a single instrument, the way it had always been. Her grip on my hand tightened. So it waited, it watched, and it chose. Chose who? My mother's eyes filled with tears. Me, she whispered. It chose me. Before we go on, I need to stop here and ask you something. This story isn't just entertainment, it's a warning. And if it's reaching you, if you're still here listening, then you need to take it seriously. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Turn on those notifications, because the stories I tell here, the ones passed down through blood and bone, they're not just stories, they're instructions. They're survival guides for a world most people don't even know exists. My mother became the sin eater of Solomon Creek in the spring of 1962, 6 months after her mother's suicide. She was 15 years old. There was no ritual this time, no bread and salt, no cup of wine. The creek had already marked her, already filled her with the fragment of sin she'd absorbed during the scattering. All she had to do was accept it, and she did, because she had no choice. The alternative was to let the creek keep taking, keep drowning children, keep driving the townspeople to madness and violence. At least if she accepted the role, she could control it, feed the creek on her own terms, protect the town the way her grandmother had protected it before Josiah Carver's sins had twisted everything. So she learned. She found the journals her grandmother had hidden, the records of the previous sin eaters, the instructions for feeding the creek safely. She started attending funerals, offering her services to grieving families, eating the sins of the dead the way her mother and grandmother had done. And every few years, when the weight became too heavy, she would walk down to Solomon Creek at midnight and give it what it wanted. What does that mean? I asked. What did you give it? My mother was quiet for a long moment. Memories, she said finally. Experiences. Pieces of the sins I'd eaten. I'd kneel at the water's edge and open myself, let the darkness pour out of me and into the creek. It felt like vomiting, but worse, like parts of my soul were being pulled out through my mouth. She shuddered, but it worked. The creek stayed quiet. The drowning stopped. For 25 years, I kept the bargain. And Solomon Creek was at peace. Then what changed? She looked at me with those sunken, haunted eyes. "You were born," she said, "and the creek decided it wanted something more. I was born in June of 1970, in the same house we lived in now. My mother never told me who my father was, and I'd stopped asking by the time I was old enough to understand that the question caused her pain. But now, on her deathbed, she told me the truth. My father wasn't a man, not exactly. He was something the creek had sent her, a shape, a presence, a thing that wore a man's form the way a hand wears a glove. It came to her one night in the spring of 1969, rose up out of the water while she was making her offering, and took what it wanted. She didn't fight it, couldn't fight it. The creek was inside her, part of her. And when it decided it wanted a child, she had no power to refuse. 9 months later, I was born, and my mother understood immediately that I wasn't entirely human. "You could feel it from the moment you drew your first breath," she said. "The creek was in you, not the way it was in me. You weren't carrying sins, weren't bound by the old bargain, but you were connected, tied to the thing at the bottom in a way I couldn't understand." She reached up and touched my face with trembling fingers. "I thought about killing you. God forgive me. I thought about it every day for the first year of your life. I thought maybe if I destroyed what the creek had made, I could break its hold over me, over the town." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "But I couldn't. You were my daughter, my baby. And even though I knew what you were, what you might become, I couldn't do it." She dropped her hand. "So I did the only thing I could think of. I kept feeding the creek, kept eating sins, kept making offerings. But I also started teaching you, preparing you, for the day when I wouldn't be here anymore, and you'd have to face it alone." "Face what?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" My mother closed her eyes. "The creek isn't satisfied with offerings anymore," she said. "It wants something more, something permanent, and it's been waiting for you, for what you are, what you can do, to make that happen." She opened her eyes one last time. "It wants to wake up, Eliza, and it thinks you're going to help it." My mother died at 3:47 in the morning on December 4th, 1987. I was holding her hand when it happened, watching her chest rise and fall in smaller and smaller increments until finally it just stopped. I should have felt grief. I should have wept and wailed and collapsed under the weight of losing her. But instead, I felt something else, something cold and ancient and terribly familiar. The creek was calling me. I stood up from my mother's bedside and walked to the window. Outside, the night was dark and still, the moon hidden behind clouds. But I could see the creek from here, a ribbon of black water winding through the trees, gleaming faintly with a light that had no source. And I could hear it, not with my ears, but with something deeper, something that had been sleeping inside me my whole life, waiting for this moment to wake up. "Come," it whispered. "Come to me. Let me show you what you really are." I wish I could tell you that I resisted, that I fought the call, stayed in the house, refused to go anywhere near that water. But I was 17 years old. My mother had just died, and everything I thought I knew about myself had been shattered in the space of a single night. So I went. I walked out of the house in my bare feet, across the frozen yard, down the slope to where Solomon Creek ran black and cold between its muddy banks. The water was higher than it should have been, lapping at the edges of the grass, reaching towards me like fingers. And there was someone standing on the other side. No, not someone, something. A shape made of shadows and creek water. Vaguely human, but wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. It stood at least 7 feet tall, its limbs too long, its head too round, its eyes 2 points of pale light that seemed to look straight through me. "Daughter," it said. The word didn't come through the air. It came through the water, through the ground, through the blood in my veins. "You've finally come." I couldn't speak, could barely breathe. But somehow I managed to form a question in my mind. "What are you?" The thing tilted its head. "I am what was here before," it said. "What will be here after. I am the hunger beneath the hills, the darkness in the deep places. I have had many names. Your people called me the throat, the thing that swallows. But you..." It took a step forward into the creek. The water rose around it, embracing it. "You can call me Father." The thing in the creek, my father, if that's what it truly was, explained what it wanted from me. And the explanation was worse than anything I could have imagined. It had been sleeping for millennia. Trapped at the bottom of the creek, bound by barriers the native peoples had erected, weakened by centuries of neglect. The offerings the sin eaters made had sustained it, kept it from dying entirely. But they weren't enough. It needed more. It needed a bridge, a living connection between itself and the world above. Someone who carried its essence but could walk in the sunlight, interact with humans, move freely through a world it could never enter on its own. Someone who could gather what it needed, not sins, not offerings, but something more fundamental. Belief. The old peoples believed in me, it said. Their belief gave me form, gave me power. But they're gone now, and the new peoples have forgotten. They walk over my grave every day and never think about what lies beneath. It stretched out one of its 2 long arms, reaching toward me across the water. But you can change that. You can remind them. You can make them believe again. And their belief will give me the strength to break free. I stared at the thing across the water. My father. The monster that had violated my mother, that had been feeding on this town for centuries, that wanted to use me to finish what it had started. And I felt the pull, the connection, the part of me that was made of creek water and darkness, that had been sleeping my whole life, now wide awake and hungry. It would be so easy to say yes, to give in, to become what it wanted me to become. But then I thought about my mother, about the 25 years she'd spent fighting this thing, feeding it just enough to keep it quiet, protecting a town that would never know the sacrifices she'd made. And I thought about the children, the 6 my grandmother had drowned against her will, the dozens more who died in the century before. All those lives swallowed by the creek, devoured by the thing that called itself my father. I wasn't going to let it happen again. I wish I could tell you that I had a plan, that I'd prepared for this moment, studied the old journals, found some weakness to exploit, but I hadn't. I was a 17-year-old girl standing barefoot in the frozen mud, facing something older than human memory. All I had was anger and the connection, because that worked both ways, didn't it? The thing was tied to me, just as I was tied to it. Its essence was in my blood, its hunger in my bones. It thought that made me its instrument, but maybe it made me something else. Maybe it made me its cage. I don't remember exactly what I did next. The memories are fragmented, scattered, like pieces of a dream that fade when you try to hold on to them. But I remember the feeling. I reached inside myself, down to the place where the creek lived, where the connection was strongest. And instead of letting the power flow outward, toward the thing, toward the world, toward whatever it wanted me to do, I pulled it inward. I swallowed it. The thing screamed, not with sound, with everything. The creek churned and boiled. The trees shook. The ground itself seemed to heave beneath my feet. But I didn't stop. I kept pulling, kept swallowing, kept taking the connection that bound us together and turning it inside out. If the thing wanted to use me as a bridge, fine, but bridges go both ways. And instead of letting it cross into my world, I was going to pull it into me. All of it. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in the next county over. A hunter had found me unconscious on the bank of Solomon Creek, my body so cold they thought I was dead. They said it was a miracle I'd survived. They didn't know about the thing inside me, the thing I'd swallowed, caged, locked away in the deepest part of my soul, the thing that still whispers to me sometimes, late at night, telling me to let it out, let it feed, let it wake. I never do. It's been 36 years now. I've lived my whole life with this thing inside me, fighting it every single day, never knowing when the fight might finally become too much. But the creek has been quiet. No more drownings, no more madness. The town of Solomon Creek doesn't know how close it came to destruction, and if I have my way, they never will. I'm 64 years old now, and I can feel the end coming. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. The cage I built is weakening. The thing inside me is getting stronger. And soon, I'll have to make the same choice my grandmother made. Do I pass it on? Find someone else to carry this burden, continue the line, keep the thing locked away for another generation? Or do I take it with me when I go, die without passing it on, and hope that when I'm gone, the thing inside me will die too? I don't know. I honestly don't know. But I know I have to tell someone. I have to make sure the story survives. Even if I don't. Because if I'm wrong, if the thing doesn't die with me, if it escapes when I'm gone, someone needs to know how to fight it. Someone needs to know about the creek, about what's buried there, about the throat that swallows and the hunger that never sleeps. So now you know. You've heard the whole story from beginning to end. The sin eaters, the offerings, the thing that wears the water like a skin. And if you ever find yourself in the hills of Virginia, passing through a little town with a creek running through it, a creek where the fish swim belly up and nothing grows on the banks, keep driving. Don't stop. Don't look. Don't let the water see you watching, because the creek remembers everything, and it's still hungry. If you've made it this far, you carry a piece of this story now. That's how it works. That's how it spreads. But don't be afraid. Knowledge is protection. As long as you know what's out there, you have a chance. Thank you for listening. Thank you for staying until the end. And whatever you do, stay away from the water.